approaching 32 minutes after 8 o'clock. Welcome back. You're watching and listening to Breakfast with me, Nana Acquair and Martin Daubney.
First, let's take a look at today's front pages.
Well, the Mirror dedicates its front page to Brazilian football icon Pelé, who died aged 82 following a battle with cancer.
The Star calls Pelé the real greatest of all time, the GOAT, with his iconic image here of the Brazilian legend with Bobby Moore. England captain, my favourite football image of all time.
Now, The Time leads on claims by ministers that the cost of strike action will force unions into climb downs as soon as spring.
And The Telegraph reports Rishi Sunak is considering the return of restrictions for arrivals from COVID-hit China, with the Health Secretary meeting Sir Chris Whitty and Jenny Harries.
Gosh, she's returning in those terrible suits. The Mail reports that millions of families are struggling with an average of over £16,000 in personal debt as unsecured borrowing hits record levels.
And onto The Independent. NHS leaders have warned that the health service is not equipped to tackle the so-called parallel pandemic of mental health exacerbated by lockdown and the cost of living.
Right, so it's time to go through the papers now. Joining us this morning is political editor of the Sunday Mirror and Sunday People, Nigel Nelson, and also broadcaster Liz Kershaw. Right, Nigel, I'm going to start with you because you've got your story in the Mail about nurses and they must promise to compromise. Time to compromise.
Yeah, and this is this was Paul Nowak, the new General Secretary of the TUC. He was introducing himself yesterday and saying quite a lot of sensible things, really. He was sort of, he's against things like secondary action, which obviously is now outlawed, and that suggests that he will also be against moving towards a general strike. But when he mentions the nurses, he says that the 19% that they're demanding just really isn't realistic. And I think it's reasonable because that they have lost 20% in real terms of their money in the last 10 years. But he's quite right. It is an unrealistic pay demand. So the important thing is, I think the nurses know this too, by the way. And so the important thing now is if the government starts talking, you can actually get a deal. The problem at the moment is the government won't even talk to them. So I don't think a 4 or 5% rise is good enough, not with inflation hitting 10%, but you might be able to compromise around 7, 8, something like that.
They offer 7%.
I was going to say, though, but the government won't talk to them in a sense because aren't their pay decided by paid bodies, so they go to paid boards rather than the government, so that's how it works.
Yes, and the trouble about the pay bodies is they're not really independent. Because they're actually bound by government constraints about what they can give. So they have to take into account things like inflation, what's affordable, and so on. So it may well be after all these strikes are over, we look again at the way the pay bodies operate. That's the government position, but it doesn't stop the government from actually giving a bit more. And bear in mind, the pay bodies actually reported back in February, long before inflation had hit the rates we've got at the moment.
I wonder, Liz, if this kind of softening of pay is actually an acknowledgement, a recognition of the fact they're not going to get a 19% pay rise, and do you think they even deserve it? I mean, nurses, of course, are amazing, but 19%, the country can't afford it.
OK, come on to that in a second, but the government, why should the government be negotiating with the nurses when you've got vast swathes of managers on 6-figure salaries in various bodies and quangos in the NHS? You've got 125 trusts, you've got NHS England, NHS Scotland, etc. You've got NHS providers, you've got all these things which I looked up online the other week. It's just ridiculous. Also, if I were a nurse and I was, say, on the median salary for a nurse, which is 31,000, and I work for one of the 70 trusts that have employed at a cost of £8.5 million the taxpayer, 170 diversity and equality officers, 3 per trust at an average of 50 grand. And I was the one who was giving people medicine and wiping their bottoms and getting them ready for theatre. And there's somebody mincing around going, oh, we need more of this box to tick. I'd be really furious. And the waste, there's a pie chart. Prescriptions, more is spent on prescriptions than is spent on medical treatment. And we're talking about,
Yeah.
is it £9 now for a prescription?
Yeah.
For a 35p box of
procurement is
paracetamol,
from Liz.
or a loaf, a special gluten-free loaf you can get, or suntan lotion. You know, I would say the nurses are probably worth more, and there would be the money for them if we got rid of all the waste.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let's move on to another health story you've picked up there today, Liz, from The Sun. This is about A&E waiting times.
Yeah, well, this is hospitals across England that have declared critical incidents, and this means that they can call on other trusts to take patients for them, and they've also can tell people not to call 999 unless it's life-threatening. How do you know that?
Yeah.
You know, if you're an old person living alone, you've fallen on the floor. There was a case last week of a man who died. He rang 3 or 4 times, and he was saying on the phone, I'm fading away, and he died. And I've had tweets this week. I posted the story about the 22-month-old child who was taken to Wigan Infirmary. Her parents were sent home told to give her water and paracetamol. They went to a cot in the morning and she was dead. There's now going to be an inquiry. Lessons will be learned. You know, there's so many scary stories around. But here we've got people on trolleys. We've got people in A&E for 40 hours. We've got an old man on a trolley in a corridor for 80 hours. We've got ambulances queuing outside. They can't deposit the patients because patients cannot be discharged because there's nowhere in the care service for them to go, or they're waiting for discharge forms and prescriptions, and it is just a mess. I think I can live with postal strikes, rail strikes, God knows what, power cuts even. I am terrified of me or somebody that I care about having an emergency health situation where we need to actually get them to see a doctor.
I think we can all agree that
it's
the
it's
NHS
really frightening.
is in need of overhaul.
So short answer your question. Yes, I think the nurses' pay should be carefully looked at, but you'd find the money if you didn't waste it.
Well, if they would stop that, Nigel, over to you now, because this is about seeing positives of UK history, because we're always showing the negative stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And
this
is Sir Tim Lawrence, who's the outgoing chair of English Heritage, who's being a bit more bullish about our past than perhaps the National Trust is at the moment. So what he's saying is that let's present the whole picture. It may not always be very pretty, but if you're going to learn from history, you've got to see everything that happened and also set it in the context of the time. What is actually unacceptable now wasn't unacceptable 500 years ago. And he doesn't directly mention it, but this is what he's getting at. It's things like pulling down statues of slavers, changing street names where there's a slavery association. He's making the point, we also recognise we also abolished slavery. We were one of the countries that led the way in that. And that if you have a statue of a slaver somewhere, that is in context. That's what was put there. It doesn't mean you agree with it. It just means it should be there. And I think he's absolutely right that we should acknowledge the past.
I totally agree. And Liz, you know, I don't know how it makes you feel. It really disgusts and saddens me, for example, when I see the Churchill statue being desecrated, being sprayed, that he's a racist. And we so infrequently hear about the fact that this guy vanquished Nazism from the European continent at a time when we get called Nazis ourselves or fascists ourselves.
Well, yeah, talking of which, I mean, what really galls me is that the very same people who are progressives, who, you know, bang on about pulling down statues or renaming Oxford University colleges, are the same people who call people who voted Brexit right-wing, and actually want, these same people who are going about slavery, and I think I had a really good education in slavery and I understand it and can sympathise to some extent, are the same people who want to carry on importing cheap labour for slave, not quite wages, because Britons won't do those dirty jobs. It's, you know, it's double standards. But in the papers again today, there are, apart from the English Heritage Trust, which Nigel was talking about, and Tim Lawrence, there are 2 other stories about the Campaign for Common Sense and History Reclaimed, which is a bunch of academics, history professors, and they are basically saying let's not rewrite our history, because the one thing that I always think when they're talking about slavery in the 18th and 19th, early 19th century until it was abolished. Try being poor in this country. Try being working class, and you were paid pennies. You were virtually a slave. Your life expectancy was 0. You were working in diseased slums. If you're an agricultural worker,
Real hardship.
Imagined
hardship.
Anybody who didn't own capital, land or wealth, probably from the slave trade, but anybody else in this country was like, literally peasant covered in filth.
I've got a question for you
and
guys.
still today, the working class, there are working class people in this country who are still exploited by capitalism. It goes on. So maybe these people, instead of harking back to the past, and maybe they should look at what's going on in modern day Britain.
Like their iPhones and iPads that some phones made by slaves.
And kids in Africa digging up rare metals.
This brings us neatly to your next story, Liz. Apparently, who would have thought it? The BBC is warping modern Britain because it's making out the left-wing BBC that we're all racist, and it's in terms of dramas. The dramas now are full of left-wing bias.
Well, it's been going on. I've worked there for 35 years, and I'm not saying it because out of bitterness, because they retired me earlier this year. But I wrote about this in newspapers while I was there, which is probably why I wasn't very popular with the management. But we were indoctrinated. I'd get cues written for me when I was doing news programmes, and I'd just put a red line through them. I'm not reading that. It's things that were given as a statement of fact.
What kind of things?
You'd get a piece to do. You'd be doing an interview about, climate change or global warming, as it was known then. It's been changed because it's not warming. But you'd get the opening paragraph would say, "We all know that man's activities are changing the world's climate." I'm not saying that. And then I'd say, "Can I have a guest on both sides, please? We were so-and-so from one university. Let's get somebody from another university." And anyway, and it was like the mantras were, "We're all going to die because of climate change. All immigration is good.
All Brexiteers are racist."
Anyway, so I can see it now. Just before I get quickly onto drama, I was watching the news the other night, and I was so incensed I nearly wrote to Ofcom, because we had this whole thing on the climate and on the weather in Britain over the last 12 months. And it was just stated as a fact that it was because of climate change, and it was the hottest year ever. No, it's not. We've had records since 1850.
To be honest, when I was at the BBC, it was the same thing. You couldn't say that you questioned climate change at all, Nigel. But your views on this, is actually there in print now? They've accepted they're left wing.
Well, yeah. I mean, what I think that happens at the BBC is that it's not. A lot of the people there are centre left. I understand that. They also bend over backwards to try and be fair to the right, and quite often you get a situation. Well, I'm sorry that they do.
That time when it was Brexit, there was only one person on the panel.
And it may well be that most people who work at the BBC were Remainers, but they used to go out of their way to try and find somebody who would present the opposite case. And often, I think that.
Why did I get phone calls from management, insidious phone calls from management, every time I tweeted my support for Brexit?
Because you're not allowed to have a view on the BBC.
Well, I am if I'm a music.
Well, that's right. I mean, the whole point there.
Sacrifice your view to work for them.
Yes, but because they're trying to be impartial.
But they're not.
And sometimes that impartiality goes a bit far in the sense that minorities actually, minority opinion often gets more airtime than it's actually due, just to get the balance going.
Well, they've got rid of all their diverse programming, or it looks like they're getting rid of them. So all their local stations, all their supposedly black programs, is what they were.
I'm sorry to see the end of that. But
they're getting rid of that. So
they're getting rid of a lot of things. I'm sorry to see go. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
It's not a matter. It's not a matter of left or right or Brexit or non-Brexit. In the news gender, it's about reporting facts and not having
or not reporting things as fact. Their opinion.
Exactly. And drama the same.
This one could only be in the Star, isn't it? This is
indeed.
All about UFOs, please.
But it's a fact.
Is it?
This is Harvard University in Massachusetts, and they've set up a speed camera to try and catch UFOs whizzing through our solar system going too fast. Now, it's not to actually give them tickets or anything like that. The argument goes that objects keep coming at us, and we only know about it when they've disappeared. So if they get the speed camera set up, they'll actually catch them. So one of the examples, 5 years ago, a 3,000 oblong thingy from deep space came at us at 196,000 miles per hour. Maybe it was a UFO, maybe not, but a telescope only picked it up, I think it's 40 days after it had passed.
Wow.
This way, we might actually catch them in the act. So if it turns out that we can find ET, wonderful.
Really?
Yeah, I often joke that if a comet did strike Earth, the BBC will probably blame Brexit. Or climate change, one of the two. Sorry to pull back to that. Liz, final story of the morning for this hour at least. From the Sun.
Yeah,
the Tories are flagging in the polls as 3 New Year's Rishi-lutions.
Yes, it's talking about Rishi Sunak has got to get to grips with the economy, inflation, convince the public that it's in safer hands with the Tories than it is with Labour. That's his first resolution. He's got to get a grip on immigration and border control and the influx of Albanians. The Convention on Human Rights has to be reviewed, and finally, the most crucial, in my opinion, he's got to have some charisma. He's got to get the Johnson factor on board, because what we need at the moment is leadership, and leadership is all about motivation. And so I've got a slogan for Rishi, if anybody would like to engage me as a personal advisor. Stimulate, regulate, motivate, because that's what it's got to do. Because it's so depressing and boring.
I would say fix the economy, sort out immigration, and
think that's a bit more.
Yeah, but I mean, the whole thing is Rishi Sunak is never going to be Boris Johnson. I mean, Boris was charismatic, but Rishi hasn't quite got that.
Can I just say, my ardent Remainer friend, who's so anti-Boris and Partygate, came for Christmas. She sat on my sofa the other night and she saw Rishi Sunak on the telly, and she went, "Oh, I do miss Boris."
Exactly. Everyone misses Boris. Boris was, at least he was interesting and inspirational in some respects. But
it was patriotic.
Well, if you just joined us, thank you very much to Nigel.
Cheers, Liz. Nigel, thank you very much. We'll see you again in the next hour. Thank you.